So thank you for coming. I'm Sarah Turner, the Dean of the Academy. As Cranbrook students know, the Critical Studies Fellowship brings to campus an outside scholar who joins our community for a semester to share their research and help us broaden our thinking. While in residence, the best fellows truly become part of the community, living and working beside the students and engaging with you both formally and informally in ways like lectures, discussion groups, walks, dinners, studio visits and field trips, slow afternoons. Jaimey exemplifies this. We found her weaving her ideas and her perspective throughout the academy and initiating new discussions and joining ones that the students had already initiated. I can't imagine that with her commitment and effort, there's anyone who could not have met her already. But if somehow you haven't, you still have time. The next rounds of discussion groups start tomorrow. And I should add that there will be a discussion group convening around Tacita Dean's lecture in Ann Arbor on Thursday. So if you're interested in learning about that or joining that, please talk to Tricia Holt after Jaimey's lecture tonight. And you know already that Jaimey Hamilton Faris comes to us from the University of Hawaii, where she's an associate professor of contemporary art and critical theory. You know too that her writing focuses on issues of globalization and translocal aesthetics or ethics in contemporary art. In her first lecture, Repeating Islands, we saw how her thinking and research, influenced in part by her own island life, and the ways she understands islands as metaphors or stages, where the implications of contemporary life and practice play out. It has not escaped her, of course, that she's come from the island of Hawaii to Cranbrook, a place with its own island qualities. She's published on these ideas and others widely in publications such as Art Journal, October, and Invisible Culture, and in essays for collections published by the Center of Pompidou and Oxford University Press. And while here, she has introduced, or maybe I should say reintroduced, other writers and thinkers like Dana Kuhl, Samantha Frost, James Bennett, and Rosie Bertotti, among others. Jaimey's research is also devoted to supporting local and international reconstructions of a vibrant Honolulu art scene, in addition to working on collections of interviews and with local Hawaii-based artists. Jaimey's been at work on a series of essays entitled Of Islands and the In-Betweens, in which she discusses the importance of contemporary art about islands, straits, and oceans. These are the ideas she outlined in her first lecture, giving us examples of the way that artists have worked to explore possibles and impossibles, conditions in ways that may be presented immaterially, but always seem to have material underpinnings and implications. I'm delighted that Jaimey can stay with us all the way up until Degree Show, helping us celebrate the accomplishments of this year. There's still a short time that we wish, so please be sure to spend as much time with her as possible while she's here. It has been wonderful to have you in crits, Jaimey, and reviews and discussions, walks on campus. And thank you for your smart observations, generous thoughts, and commitment to our community. And it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the podium.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So, as you all know by now, the two lectures that I'm giving here at Cranbrook relate to the book I'm working on, Of Islands and the In-Between. My last lecture was on islands, so that was pretty straightforward, but perhaps tonight's lecture on the in-between will need a little bit more explanation. This will come as the lecture unfolds, but briefly, what I mean to focus on is the geoaesthetics of the watery elements, the oceans and seas through which vessels move from island to island. While it seemed natural to divide these lectures in terms of islands and oceans, it was actually really hard to decide which lecture to give first. I could have started with oceans, since it seems to be the space of the journey, and it would have been natural to end with islands as destinations. But I wanted to flip this for a number of reasons. Firstly, I don't see islands as mere isolated endpoints. I argued in my last lecture that they have become important geopoetic imaginaries precisely because they move. Their volcanic, rhizomatic, and archipelagic relations give us some new ways to see the world as a whole. The other reason I wanted to talk about oceans after islands is because I wanted to emphasize the journey itself and to keep us as long as possible in these aquatic expanses. I relish the space of the ocean and the way it is an important geopoetic materialist allegory of delay. It literally slows my heartbeat down when I'm swimming in it, and it sometimes holds me in a state of suspension while the pressing concerns of my minute-by-minute life shrink on the horizon. It also makes us lose our bearings, and I hope you all feel this knot in your stomach that's similar to mine from watching this queasy video as we waited for the lecture to start. It can, and that potential of the ocean to delay us is captured in that video. And the video is by Brazilian artist Taigo Rocapita, and its premise is very simple. An overturned boat drifting on the surface of an overturned ocean horizon. And because both ocean and boat are flipped, it takes a minute to reorient. But in that moment, we seem to be swimming in the sky, looking at an island held in place by the pressure of the atmosphere. We are dumped out of our vessel and give ourselves over to the currents. What this film does is establish a relationship between oceanic delay and perceptual delay. And this is the geopoetics that I want to attend to tonight. During my last lecture, someone asked, can art help us find solutions to the overwhelming complexity of climate change? The short answer is, solutions as such are never really solutions in which we can wipe our hands of a problem. In art, no less than politics and environmental science. The number of factors at play in understanding the world's weather and ecological patterns in relation to human activities has led us into an uncertain territory. Proposals continue, let's see, lost the screen here. Connection, technology problems. Problems are not so easy, are they, to solve? In keeping with my theme. Is it this connection?
No, it would be this one.
Might have to reboot the computer. Sorry. Okay. Very nice, very nice. That problem was fairly easy to resolve, thank goodness. I'm talking about larger problems. Okay. And these larger problems, like climate change, proposals continue to be unveiled. Everything from biodiesel, ethanol, to nuclear reactors, to fertilizing the ocean with iron. We should maybe be a bit wary of these as be-all, end-all, elegant solutions, because we can see in hindsight that many of our historical efforts at problem solving look a little like ants scurrying aimlessly across sidewalks. In fact, many of our solutions for progressing civilization, including finding and settling new land, or searching for new energy resources, look exactly like meandering ant lines. Take this map of Captain Cook's travels through the Pacific, and that's on the top, or Herman Melville's travels on whaling ships. I'm deeply fascinated by Melville's whaling experience, and you can see the lines of his travel there. As absurd as it sounds, these whaling ships, were prime engines for harvesting clean energy before petroleum. The absurdity of whale blubber as a 19th century energy solution is a useful and humbling allegory of our current methods of resource extraction. Like it or not, our solutions rarely cut a straight line, and usually lead to more problems. This isn't to say that we shouldn't stop finding solutions, and really we can't help ourselves. But jumping from solution to solution or island to island without pause for considering indirect consequences has led to many of our current geopolitical predicaments. So within this dynamic, the ocean, I see it, is often a humbling reminder that the Earth and cosmos work through invisible forces that we still cannot understand, much less control. Even deep into the age of discovery, Benjamin Franklin was just beginning to chart the Gulf Stream. Since the turn of the 20th century, we've collected piles of data to take advantage of the ocean's currents, but we often miscalculate. Rough seas of the roaring 40s still appeal to shipping lines, but always at a certain cost. Sargasso grasses in the Caribbean that once gripped slave ships still cause problems. The ocean generates dangerous fog and also tsunamis and hurricanes that wipe out whole islands and seaside cities. Flagging winds in the middle of the Pacific Gyre leave yachts stranded for weeks. As much as we know about ocean currents and tidal shifts propelled by universal magnetic and gravitational forces, they can change their local conditions moment by moment, and so are still considered to be mysterious and whimsical, impeding our drive for progress. Our drive for progress. The ocean as debaser of human progress. This is a pretty consistent allegory in our history of maritime imagery. From Turner's Slave Ship to contemporary art like these monumental chalkboards by Tacita Dean. And I'll return to these at the end of the lecture. Rocapita's flipped boat operates in a similar but more deadpan and quiet way. Here's another variation by Dutch artist Melanie Benayo, who leaves out the ship and literalizes the allegory with her sign. Her back turned to the shore break, she's knocked down, pathetically still trying to hold up the cardboard sign. Benayo's piece also references Anselm Kiefer's series, Heroic Symbols. In these images from the late 60s, still a complicated time in Germany's history, he performed the taboo Nazi salute in a number of different environments. The performative photos that incorporate the ocean draw on Caspar David Friedrich's famous painting Monk by Sea, which is at the top there, and Kiefer draws a connection between German fascism and the history of German romantic transcendentalism, but also provides a deadpan commentary on how such gestures of power are rather pathetic in relationship to the sublime forces of the sea. This is another piece I'm rather fond of by Michael Arcega called Walnut Traverse. He uses wall plaques that are usually markers of achievement and installs them on the gallery wall with holes for gripping. And they read as islands in an expansive sea that we're invited to climb. But they're just far enough away from each other and not with quite enough grip that we end up hugging the wall in a state of suspended contemplation between islands. And Arcega calls this futilitarianism, a useful futility in acknowledging nature's consistent thwarting of our progress. And it brings me back to my goal for tonight. How can we savor this futilitarian space and time of the in-between? It seems to me that one of the things art can do is move our focus from the drive for resolutions, conclusions, and solutions to that futilitarian space of irresolutions, delay, and failure. If we can learn to reside in that space a bit longer, perhaps it will force us to more thoroughly consider our eventual and inevitable choices. Usually we ignore such pauses. A ready allegory for this kind of attitude towards delay, as I've already hinted, can be found in Melville's Moby Dick. The novel is ostensibly about Ahab, obsessed, and Ahab here is Gregory Peck. Ahab is obsessed with seeking revenge on the white Leviathan who took his leg. In hubristic fashion, Ahab declares that the ocean cannot stop him from finding his whale. He says in dramatic fashion, "Swerve me, the path to my fixed purpose is laid with iron rails, whereon my soul is grooved to run. Not an obstacle, not an angle to the iron way." We know, of course, that the ocean is not a straight iron rail, and Ahab is swerved quite a bit by Moby Dick in his final chase, and it's illustrated in the book, at the end of the book, in this zigzaggy pattern here. But before we even get to the end chapters, and I don't know how many of you have even opened Moby Dick to experience this. Before we get to the final chapters, we as readers have to slog through 500 pages of preparation, detours, and waiting on the Pequod. Throughout those pages, we find Ahab frustrated by the delay, pacing the deck with his peg leg, calling out periodically to the watchman, "What do you see?" To which the watchman replies, "Nothing, nothing, sir." In fact, what the watchman probably saw was not nothing at all, but the wide and reflective surfaces of the ocean. A very interesting something that can best be seen only in the space of delay, boredom, waiting, and looking. It probably looked a little like this Vija Kelman drawing of the ocean. Ahab and his crew mostly ignored such spaces of delay, but Kelman attends to them quite consistently in her intensively detailed method of drawing and painting nature. In her ocean series, she invites us as viewers into the frequency and patterns of waves, enfolded and unfolded everywhere. Material vibrations are constantly shifting between reflection and depth. As a drawing, it takes us from the illusionistic space of the water's surface to the rise and fall of the graphite that follows the tooth of the paper. With no horizon lines in sight, we can imagine expanding infinitely into her spaces. This classic formalist dynamic is usually talked about in the relationship between pictorial space and the flatness of the picture plane, but I actually prefer Deleuze's terminology. He would have described Kelman's oceans as a virtual or smooth space, opening in the midst of our normally stabilized absolute coordinates, which he called striated space. I like these terms because they don't demarcate clear lines between imagination and real space, and it allows an understanding of how virtual space can affect our real space. Deleuze most clearly describes the capacity for art to create some seemingly illogical spaces of conceptual delay in his book on Francis Bacon. Now, Bacon often depicted the figure in a seemingly confined environment, what Deleuze would call a striated, vaguely institutional space. But in the middle of that space, he would often create passages, a la Cézanne, in which a virtual space as big and wide as the ocean could be opened. Not just the illusion of space behind a painted curtain, but space in which the figure becomes the curtain and the wall. This is an imaginary, intensive space in which we as viewers create new cognitive connections. Bacon creates planes where there shouldn't be any, and thus creates moments of delay between perception and understanding, what Deleuze ultimately calls affect, a key moment in aesthetics in which a viewer is potentially swerved and moved in new directions of emotional and intellectual engagement. And tonight, by virtue of our digital projector, and especially if you're sitting in the front rows, there is this possibility for you to be transfixed by the kind of weird, flat, but endless space that Kelman creates. And within that possibility, there's another possibility of relinquishing some of the hold of the auditorium space and the time of school and work that has gripped your body. And this smooth virtual space cuts across striated space. And it also allows me to move from this kind of experiential delay to this kind, so that we can explore on a more general level the important notion of delay that I'm talking about. In his notes for constructing Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, otherwise known as Large Glass, Duchamp famously wrote, "Use delay instead of picture." Duchamp was trying to find ways to stave off the dominance and priority of retinal art, what he considered painting's cliched techniques. He built the large glass in reference to a whole history of correct perspective and actually used Durer's notes, like the one I have here at the top, as fodder for his project. But he also delayed any purely retinal reading of his painting by making it in glass. This again is a delay in which pictorial space is penetrated by the real space of the viewer. A further delay can be found in Duchamp's method for painting his figures, which was to allow dust to accumulate undisturbed on the surface of the glass over the months that he made his Atlantic crossings to Paris and New York. This in turn is consistent with the allegory of large glass, delayed desire, impotent bachelors who cannot reach their bride, And these conceptual delays are related to what Duchamp famously called the infrathin. Quote, the possible implying the becoming, the passage from one to the other takes place in the infrathin, unquote. Duchamp's explorations of delay can be seen as part of a larger project of understanding the complexity of representation itself. In the history of phenomenology, for instance, philosophers have long been interested in how representation is formed in the temporal and cognitive delay between memory and experience. The durational qualities of our perceptions of space and time became a central concern for many conceptual video projects in the 1970s, perhaps best summed up by Dan Graham's piece, Time Delay Room. And this piece is a closed-circuit installation with 2 rooms of equal size, outfitted with camera and monitors showing the other room. One is on an 8-second delay. And this creates a confusing moment in which a viewer moving into the other room witnesses herself in the past. Yet the time is so infrathin that she might not recognize the image as of the past, causing dysphagia in the subtle feedback loop cycling between the actual and perceived experience of the body. Delays and in-between spaces are everywhere in contemporary theories of representation. And here I'm going to show you a few graphs, not talk about them, don't worry. Delays and in-between spaces are everywhere in contemporary theories of representation. In the history of semiotics, Barth identified the third meaning in spaces where signifiers and signifieds don't add up easily. Derrida later came up with a more sophisticated explanation for this in his concept of difference. Lacan's psychoanalytic theories of identity construction articulate how ideological forces exploit the gap between experience and desire for meaning. And I'm going quickly through these theories in the hopes that we can spend some time with them in seminar connecting the dots together. But let me continue in this vein a minute longer to bring us back to oceans as a space of delay. Psychoanalysis has informed the politics of representing identity, often described as the space between self and other. In Homi Bhabha's famous Location of Culture, he theorized the space of hybridity, an interstitial no man's land outside the borders of national and racial identification. An ambivalent and hence delayed subject is caught between identifications. To help describe these so-called hybrid spaces, Bhabha chose Anish Kapoor's Blue Voids to be featured prominently on the cover of his book. Kapoor was a natural choice because of his long-standing interest in exploring identity obliquely and abstractly through virtual spaces created by optical illusions. Some were caused by perceptions of light as absorbed by the pigment, as in this piece of sculpture right here, and some refracted through various concave and convex mirrors, which is what Kapoor has been exploring recently. Feminist theory has tried to shake off the influence of Lacanian modes of identity based on difference, which traditionally figured that in-between space as a void, a lack, or a trauma. Discounting this negative history of the interstitial, artist and theorist Bracha Ettinger has called for a strategic embrace of this gap as what she calls matrixial space, a space of positive desire and meeting between the self and other. She talks of that space not as traumatic, but as one of mutual interest, coming from the etymological root of interest, interesse, being in between. This provides a way, she argues, to see the gap of identity's representation as an important moment in which there is a willingness to be taken out of oneself in order to encounter that which is other. This is an all too schematic view of theories of representation, but I hope you notice how much these spaces, though not about the ocean per se, often graphically represented through waves, reflection, fluidity. They're very reminiscent of water's complex spatial structure. Because many theories of representation are now grappling with the history of migration and globalization, the ocean is figured even more explicitly as an interstitial space. In the Black Atlantic, for example, Paul Gilroy was interested in the Middle Passage, the traumatic migratory space of becoming a slave and its effects on transcultural identity in the modern era. He articulates the ocean primarily as the striated space of imperialism, but also tries to take account of the Middle Passage in which not all went according to slavery's plans. Even in the most impossible conditions, creativity, rebellion, and lines of flight happened. The stories emerging from this traumatic space have become inspiration for artists like Allan Gallahger, whose watercolors, collages, and animations of the Watery Ecstatic imagine the ocean depths as a potential virtual space to create a fluid space for identity. A recurring figure, back to Ahab here, a recurring figure in Gallagher's work is Pegleg, a conflation of one-legged tap dancer Pegleg Bates and Captain Ahab. The character emerged originally from Gallagher's signature plasticine collages over found advertisements from Black culture magazines. Pegleg subtly references both the strange racial fluidity of the vaudevillian and of Ahab, who is obliquely referred to as a man of darker complexion by Melville. And this has led Gallagher to pursue readings of Moby Dick as a critique of race. And I won't get into that here, but it's a fascinating wormhole unto itself. Gallagher ultimately sees Pegleg as host and guide to her underwater world. And this world is loosely based on myths told by the Detroit house band from the 1980s, Drexciya, who she says imagine a black Atlantis made up of women and children who went overboard during the Middle Passage. She has figured this mythopoetic landscape in collages like Coral Cities from 2007, and also in a number of watercolors, scrimshaws, and animations. Here the characters are cared for by a whale who distributes air to them down on the bottom of the ocean. And in this video, I'm going to start this video here, and it's silent. I just want to show you the animation that follows her talking. In this video, she uses scrimshaw to cut into the watercolor paper, opening up the two-dimensional surface into a hybrid space in which the human head becomes fish, able to fluidly shift because of the cuts that create endless interconnected surfaces. In other words, she turns scrimshaw into Mobius strips. Surface becomes space. The non-Euclidean geometry leads to interesting points of connections and tensions in which her world can proliferate and mutate endlessly. In other images, her hybrid underwater creatures are Sargasso grasses. Having been uprooted from coasts, they have survived for centuries as a rootless rhizome on the surface of the ocean. Gallagher has created an underwater world of floating relations that attend to the productivity of delay, of staying in that in-between state. As Gallagher puts it, the voyage itself becomes a kind of origin myth that I am referring to. For me, what's important is the Middle Passage itself, rather than some version of an origin myth based on a Mother Africa. Uprooted from any territory, Gallagher's images offer a proliferating ocean diversity that can foster a sensitivity to the representation of identity as becoming. What are some other ways in which virtual or smooth space can contravene and delay our perceptions of the striated space of maritime history? Perhaps the best known example is Allan Sekula's work, his photo essay Fish Story, and his film co-directed with Noel Birch, Forgotten Space. Over decades of research, photographer Allan Sekula documented the network of shipping ports as nodes of material accumulation and labor exploitation that give capitalism its speed and fluidity. Graphed from above, global transportation looks like this. No meandering lines, but ideal arcs in which airports and wharfs connect to the just-in-time production of factories and the perfectly restocked supermarket shelves. This is the time of things, the striated space of capitalism, the reifying trajectories of commerce that have cohered into particular routes. In these maps, the ocean is not a capricious cauldron of weather, but a frictionless Pacific water that lubricates trade. In Fish Story, published in 1995, Sekula offered a different view. The photos feature the main activity of ports, as well as the quieter spaces of labor and out-of-sight ships and container graveyards. Sekula called his book Fish Story in specific reference to Melville's whale story and a long history of exaggerated fisher folk tales of adventure often told by fishermen. In putting this title in playful paradox with the images of drudgery and isolation of a sailor's life, Sekula's Fish Story is meant to make the connection between the container ship and the whaling ship. If Melville deflated the egoist romance of whaling as the big industry of his day, Sekula forces us to reconsider the fluidity of the shipping industry by focusing on similar spatial and temporal slowness as it is felt on board the container ships. In Forgotten Space, he records the massive automated ports at Rotterdam, San Pedro, and Hong Kong, which makes the whole operation feel especially grand. But he also photographs them at sea, from the top of the containers. And in this space, the ships feel relatively small against the smooth open space of an endless horizon of waves and weather. And just to give you a sense of Sekula's method of talking about this, I want to show you the trailer for Forgotten Space. Some of you have probably seen it before. It's 2 minutes long.
Forgotten space, out of sight, out of mind. Upstream, the hinterland, a greedy continent. Downstream, other ports, great harbor cities, oceans, 100,000 invisible ships, 1.5 million invisible seafarers, binding the world together through trade. The unlikely story of a steel box that changed the world trading system. Ships now resemble floating warehouses, plying fixed routes between producing countries and consuming countries, while factories become ship-like, stealing away in the dead of night in search of cheaper labor. Does the anonymity of the box turn the sea of exploit and adventure into a lake of invisible drudgery? Does this box, the acme of order, efficiency, and global progress, create disorder and destruction and throw the world out of balance?
So Sekula's projects have become important hallmarks in photography. Emerging from conceptual Marxist practices initiated in the 70s by the likes of Martha Rossler and Victor Bergen, he consistently explored the role of documentary with its contextualizing voiceover as a method of articulating in a clear and very unambiguous way a critique of capitalism. Sekula's influence is undeniable, and yet his critical realism depends very heavily on his voiceovers, which can feel a bit didactic and has needed a bit of updating, I think. So one approach that has become more and more prevalent is the kind of affective and intensive materialist documentary filmmaking. One of the most interesting proponents of this method is Sensory Ethnography Lab. And they run a cross-disciplinary graduate program out of Harvard. Last year, their film Leviathan, directed by Verenya Paraval and Lucien Castan-Taylor, was featured at the Whitney Biennial. Sell's method is a combination of materialist aesthetics and ethnography, essentially converting Alfred Gell's method of what he calls thick description, outlined in his book Art and Agency in 1998. Gell's anthropological approach is to write an accumulation, almost an obsessive accumulation of observations that not only focus on human subjects, but also material technology. It's a strategic kind of anthropology and one that has garnered a fair amount of criticism, but nonetheless it has useful applications. And Sell's use of film to create an effective delay, I think, is one of the best applications. Leviathan focuses on a commercial trawling vessel operating out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, also the origin of Melville's Pequod. In an 87-minute-long video shot with multiple GoPro cameras mounted all over the ship, the film captures the immense power of the machine, but also the unbelievable power of the ocean and its creatures. With no voiceovers to offer interpretation or human positioning, the film instead makes heavy use of editing, along with very calculated sound design to create an overwhelmingly luscious, absorbing, and disorienting experience. Let's see if I can play that for you here. I'm going to play the trailer. If I can. Mm-hmm. So, though it's not filmed in a typical manner, and it's certainly not an objective film, it does, I would argue, provide an utterly realist and materialist experience. Its power is in giving us an opportunity to feel not only what it's like to be on the ship, but to actually be the ship. We're attached to the ship. The visuals are attached to the ship. In this clip, I don't have sound on this one. In this clip, the GoPro camera is positioned at the bottom of the ship's hull. So we see the net release and the fish fill our space. The eyes and the bodies of the fish are everywhere in total chaos, filling the monumental void, and eventually obliterating our vision. And the immense life of the ocean meets its anonymous death here. And so the film doesn't rely on the distanciation techniques of Sekula in order to create this critical moment. It relies instead on a certain kind of pleasure and terror we experience from our uncomfortable post-humanist identifications with the overwhelming materiality of the ship, the ocean, and the fish, the confusion of these surfaces so close to the camera's eye. When the film does focus on more human spaces, it still positions us in a similarly intensive way. We are the eyes of the ship, only getting fragments and close-ups of the workers' tattoos and sweaty skin. Even in a few traditional shots like this one, a bleary-eyed modern-day Ishmael who appears to be barely awake as he operates dangerous cranes to the tune of death metal, and I wish you could hear that in the background. These images are composed through a reflective, mediated glass of the ship. In titling their film Leviathan, the filmmakers, like Sekula, references the allegory of Ahab and the great white whale. And also like Sekula, they seem to be pointing to Melville's underlying message, that the real monster is not the sea creature, but man and his designs to control nature. As Melville writes, there is no folly of the beast of the earth which is not infinitely outdone by the madness of men. Both Sekula and Sells' films show this madness to be now so thoroughly widespread as to be almost fully automated. Strictly speaking, there are no Ahabs on board these container and fishing ships. The individual's madness has become systemic and many hydra form. To get back to the issue of delay here, what I want ultimately to suggest is that Sells' current trajectory of a materialist critical realism offers us some interesting strategic openings in our current overly striated space of capitalist representation. The camera's strategic positioning of our vision in the immediacy of surfaces and sounds throws us into the virtual and smooth space of the ship meeting ocean and its elements. We become enmeshed and slowed down by the tension of the water and the claustrophobic swirls of the gulls. Sells' work is part of a necessary trajectory for critical realism, part of a wider genre of materialist imagery that creates visibility for aspects of our exploration of the earth that we often refuse to pay attention to. Artists can make ships turn into beached whales and beached whales into toxic chemical spills. If these images disgust or upset us, it's worth taking a moment to ask why. I will only just touch on this here, but I think it's worth considering the necessity of such images to offset the focus on what contemporary critics call accelerationism. This is a term which captures much of the hyper-commodified, slick, fast-paced, and even ironic work of today. Art that plays on the speed of Hollywood cinema, Family Guy, the news, the stock market. Art that draws out what it feels like to live in the contemporary moment of capitalist absorption. The problem with the ambiguous tactics of accelerationism is that it usually feeds back into the belly of the beast without offering much in the way of delaying or deterring our perception of it. So I'm going to be upfront and partisan here in saying that I think we need more materialist anti-epics like Leviathan without the stabilized Hollywood shot reverse shot and other overtly conventional Euclidean coordinates of representation. In these kinds of films, we lose ourselves in thick description. And in attending to the closeness and thingness of the world to our bodies, what Deleuze refers to as the smooth, abstracted space of hexaides, we suddenly have an alternative access to the world. And if we follow this thread of anti-epics a bit longer, I want to introduce one more into the mix with artist Tacita Dean. Dean has long been fascinated by the ocean's ability to induce our failure in mastering space and time. She started this exploration with a series of chalkboard drawings called The Roaring Forties, 7 Boards in 7 Days from 1997, and one I'm showing you here. Each picture is treated very overtly and consciously as a storyboard. Dean positions the boat and the waves in dramatic fashion, and then in scrawled handwriting inserts relevant filmic notes on the sides. There are shot directions, there are time and light requirements, there are wind cues, and this is her ironic nod to our love of the epic, omnipresent position of the human filmmaker who thinks she can bend nature, like Ahab, to her iron rail will. These pieces in turn are part of Dean's dispersed and disorienting approach to visual storytelling that ultimately undermines such notions of omniscience and control. Perhaps this is most easily told in a story that motivated a related series of works, the film Tingmouth Electron and Disappearance at Sea 1 and 2. The story is of Daniel Crowthirst, a man with a little boating experience who in 1968 got it into his head that he would enter the London Sunday Times Golden Globe single-handed round-the-world yacht race. His determination set him on a path of delusion in which he sailed out of Tingmouth Harbor on a boat unfit to make it through the roaring 40s. When he realized he wouldn't make it, he began to drift. And at the same time, he entered fictional bearings in his logbook and called them into the officials as if he was still on course and he was actually winning the race. As he immersed himself in this fiction and most likely experienced immense guilt and shame, his faulty chronometer got him lost. Dean imagines that he experienced the onset of time madness and jumped off the ship with the chronometer as the weight that dragged him to the bottom of the ocean. For the project, Dean went hunting for information, images, as well as the boat that Crowthirst sailed, which she eventually found washed ashore on the Cayman Islands. In pursuing the mystery of Crowthirst's motivation, she uncovers elements of conspiracy, that the town board wouldn't let him back out, even though they knew the boat was not worthy of the race. And she also pursues multiple tangents, like the bubble house she discovers on the Cayman Islands, which is up there on the top corner, and also lighthouses off the coast of Scotland. For this series, she made 2 lighthouse films, titled Disappearance 1 and 2, in which we experience eerie refractions of space and light caught in the Fresnel lens prisms and the filaments of the bulbs. For Disappearance at Sea 2, she actually placed her camera on the rotating disc at the center of the lighthouse, and this functions as a still point on the globe, but its constant rotation is confusing to the viewer as we watch the film. Dean was fascinated by these interconnecting elements of failure, confusion, and unknowability, and she constructs her representations in a comparable way. In fact, she does not explicitly tell the story of Crowthirst, but lets it kind of seep into the allegorical spaces within and between the images she shows in the gallery. It is not an extreme kind of spatial and temporal confusion like the one that Crowthirst himself experienced, but it runs in useful parallel so that we can see at least how he grappled how she grappled with Crowthirst's motives, or for that matter, Dean's own conspiratorial pursuit in the project. And in that delay, we open ourselves to multiple vectors of questions, identifications, and possible trajectories. So what I've been talking about in terms of delay is fairly external, right? The ways in which representations of the ocean's materiality can literally slow our conception of the world as a fast space down. But I think it's important to attend to the ways in which delay is actually an internal condition, a psychology of expectation. Delay stems from our subjective interpretation of external forces. It is often our perception that things, people, and forces seem to be in our way. Inclement weather forces us to reroute. Flights are canceled. Computer files open too slow. Operators put us on hold. Delay is often perceived as a conspiracy of things. Coat racks that nail themselves to the middle of the floor against our expectation of deserved onward motion. And in this case, this is literally a data conspiracy. But nature's forces are not inherently malevolent. It's often our sense of entitlement that makes them seem so. So what I'm trying to articulate in general here are the ways in which representations can delay our immediate desire for such expectations in consuming and understanding the world, and that this delay is a useful pause in our insistent and incessant goal-oriented, destination-centric focus. If we suspend ourselves, our commitments, and our causal understandings, we might better understand that fundamentally, in the grander scheme of things, our lives are in fact endless journeys, always in between. So when material forces do slow us down, that space of delay, if we allow it, as I have been arguing that we should, can also be a productive space of reflection in which we can begin to ask, what are we really being delayed from? Why are we in such a hurry all the time? And what are these Leviathans we're chasing? This is not to say that we should or could always and forever remain in a space of suspension and non-expectation. The trick is to use the space of delay, however momentarily it may be, as a productive, creative, effective moment in which courses of action can be rethought and reimagined with new and expansive potentialities. To really give this this idea some weighty pause, I want to leave you with one last image of the ocean. This is a still from Tacita Dean's Green Ray, a film she made in 2001 off the coast of Madagascar. Dean was in search of that elusive single flash of green that happens when the sun disappears on a clear evening over the water's reflective horizon. And as she let the film roll and watched through the lens each evening over the course of a few weeks, she did not see any green rays. Her companions with video cameras also saw nothing, which they verified by looking through their instantly accessible footage. No green ray. But when Dean processed her film stock weeks later, there it was. By then, it seemed to be an illusion created by the chemical process of developing the film stock. And in many ways, this moment of delayed, ambivalent satisfaction addresses Captain Ahab's iron will of expectation. We too often fix our purposes in relation to the world. We too often find ourselves expecting to see that green ray to confirm its existence. As Dean has come to learn, the green ray puts our own fallible perception in useful delay. The green is not an absolute point on the horizon, or an absolute on our horizon of expectation. It is an elusive moment in between the time we spend waiting for the sun to set and all the moments after the sun sets, when we aren't sure whether we've really seen it or not. Thank you.